This experience happened at my uncle's house back in 2001. A little backstory to give more clarity about my experiences. I grew up in San Francisco, and after I graduated from high school, I decided to move to a small town where my dad's family lives. This town was 3 hours south of San Francisco and had a population of 70,000. It was a nice change from the big city life I had for 14 years prior. When I finally moved, I went over to my uncle's house and asked if I could speak to him briefly. He said, "Sure." He then motioned for us to move toward the little table next to the kitchen to sit down and talk. I asked him if I could live with him and Auntie for a while as I attended community college, adding that I didn't like living alone in a new town I just moved to. He replied, "I think that will be fine." I told him how thankful I was and that if he needed me to help out with anything around the house to let me know. I then left to get my things, and in a few hours, I came back and only brought with me what I needed: clothes, my books, toothbrush, and some CDs. Almost immediately, I felt a vibe that someone else was in the home, knowing that it was only my uncle and me at that time. This perplexed me. I compare this to a feeling when you go to a friend's house for a party and there were people walking around. It wasn't necessarily a bad feeling, but it got my attention. One day I saw my uncle doing beadwork at the table, listening to a radio talk show. I asked if I could sit with him and listen. He said, "Sure, come and sit." I told him that I wanted to tell him something I experienced when I moved into his house on the first day, and added that I hoped he didn't think I was weird. He said, "Go ahead, tell me," and I told him my feeling of there being a vibe of other people in the house when there was only me and him in the home at the time when I moved in. He said, "You know, I'll tell you this, all the years that I have lived here, I have had some experiences that I couldn't explain, and they didn't scare me much, but I noticed them." I replied, "Tell me one thing that happened." He replied, "One night I was watching the History Channel, and I was by myself in the house. It was close to 9 p.m. at night, and your auntie wasn't home yet from her late shift at the hospital. I was in my recliner, and behind me in the kitchen, I heard the drawers and cabinets. I went to turn on the kitchen lights, and a few of the drawers and cabinets were opened out all the way. So I believe you. I don't think you are weird or anything." A few months later, I had my own experience. When my experience happened, I was the only one in the home as my uncle and my auntie were out for a while. My cousin Mary was away attending her first year at university. So I was given her room by my uncle when I moved in. I was walking down the hallway leading to this room one night, and it was pitch black, as it usually is. This being my uncle's house, it was far out in the country and the last house on the block next to a field. There were also barely any street lights to shine inward toward the home. I turned to the right down the hallway leading to my new room. By this time, I have grown used to walking into the center of the room to pull the long string tied to the ceiling fan to turn on the light bulb. This ceiling fan was also in the middle of the room. I was feeling around in the dark for the string, and then suddenly I saw something darker than my pitch black room come toward me. When this thing came toward me, it started to push me out of the room. And I wasn't able to see out of my left eye, which was even stranger. Of course, initially I thought it was a person, but while it was pushing me, I knew it wasn't human because it didn't have the characteristics of what a human's arms, hands, and body feel like. What would be this thing's arms and hands felt much bigger, and where the fingers would be, I would compare it to something like paws, but without the nails and claws. And additionally, I felt this thing go through me during the whole time it was pushing me. After the pushing stopped, I was finally able to see out of my left eye again. I then found myself completely outside of my room in front of the bathroom door. I just couldn't believe it. I was shocked and didn't understand what just happened. When I looked at how far I was pushed out of the room from where my ceiling fan was to where I found myself, it was a total distance of about 8 feet. Thoughts going through my head were, "That is impossible. What in the world just happened? What was that?" Whenever I look back on this experience, it is still one of the strangest that I have had in my life among all of the other experiences I have had. When I did research on the previous families and history of the house, there was a woman that lived there until old age, but there wasn't anything else I was able to find out. I've recently moved to Weed, California, a small town next to Mount Shasta, for work. I'm an avid hiker and love exploring, so naturally, 2 days ago I decided to go hike the mountain on one of my days off. Not entirely sure why, but I decided to drive my car very deep into the forest surrounding the base of the mountain, as far as the dirt road would allow me. It was around 3 p.m. with a clear sky, so I was very confident and enjoying the scenery as I got out of my car and started my hike, heading closer to the mountain. At first, it was your regular everyday hike, lots of birds and squirrels around. That smell of nature that fills your lungs as you walk across the terrain. It wasn't until I reached a small dried-up river that I noticed something was off. As I stopped to look at the dried-up river and take pictures, I noticed that it was strangely very, very quiet. No birds chirping, no signs of squirrels or other animals, and even the sound of the wind you hear when you're on a mountain seemed to be completely gone. At the time, I thought it was just an odd coincidence and started walking up alongside the river. But as I kept walking and being able to only hear my footsteps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not the kind of feeling that makes you think someone is outside your window watching you. The kind of feeling that makes you feel multiple people or things are observing your every movement, studying you. I've never had that kind of feeling in my life. But what happened after made me completely forget about that feeling. I suddenly started to hear something out of nowhere that sounded like angelic humming or maybe a song with no lyrics. But it also sounded strangely electric, like the sound telephone lines make. It wasn't very loud, but enough to make me look in the direction it was coming from. I looked to the other side of the dried-up river that had multiple trees and other foliage to see someone or something looking straight at me. It almost looked like a ghost with it looking completely white. But this thing was very clearly there. It almost looked like it was wearing a robe, but I couldn't see any feet, hands, or even a face. Although it had an oval head. However, I could feel it looking straight at me, almost as if it was trying to remember my every detail. Even from afar away, I could tell that its entire body had a very weird texture, almost like porcelain, but if porcelain was a silky fabric. It was very obviously not human. I was very understandably in complete shock and terror. Frozen in place, kind of scared. We both looked at each other for what felt like forever, but it was most likely around 30 seconds. I very, very slowly started walking backward. I don't think I took more than 2 steps when it tilted its head, as if it was curious or even surprised at what I was doing. All the while I could still hear that electric angelic humming. And I swear it got a little louder when I took those steps back. When I turned my head to look behind me, to make sure the way was clear so I could run, the song suddenly stopped. Abruptly, without warning. This shocked me, and when I turned back to look at the thing, it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. As soon as I saw that it disappeared, I ran as fast as I could, following the path I took back. Even after it had disappeared, and while I was running, I could still feel like I was being watched from all sides. I almost tripped a few times in how fast I was going. When I got to my car, sounds of animals and the mountain winds suddenly came back, but I was still scared out of my mind and drove as fast as I could away from the mountain. I've never had anything paranormal happen to me in the past, and I've honestly always been very skeptical of stuff like that. But this experience has left me questioning a lot of things. I don't think I want to go back on that mountain. I've even had a nightmare about the experience. I'm not even sure what I saw or what to call it. I used to work in a casino. One night, I was approached by an elderly woman asking about paging someone over the intercom. I tried to explain where to go, but she insisted I personally walk her to the desk where they can do that. As I walked her through the casino, she started talking to me. She mentioned she was a medium and how her family has always strictly advised her against sharing that information with people. When you work in a casino, you encounter a lot of scammers and odd people. I was polite, but tried not to engage with her much on the topic. As we kept walking, she said something to me about my sister. I stopped and asked how she knew my sister. She didn't, but started talking to me at great lengths about my family. At this particular time, my sister was going through a very difficult time in life that was impacting our family as a whole. I was skeptical but curious. As she went on, I was careful to neither confirm nor deny anything but just listen to what she had to say. She went into great detail about how my father, mother, and even I played into the current situation. She even began to become visibly emotional as if she could feel what my mother was feeling. I was utterly astonished as she told me that I, being the oldest and most diplomatic in my family dynamic, needed to be more outspoken with everyone involved. Everything she had told me was undeniably accurate and insightful. But then she shifted her focus. She told me about someone I worked with and went into great detail about what this person looked like and how they felt about me. She talked about the dynamic between us and advised me to take caution. At this point, she had lost me. I couldn't think of a single person or relationship in my working life that fit that description. I began becoming more skeptical again and reminded her I needed to get back to work and to keep walking towards our destination. She kept talking to me as we walked, and I began to once again find myself astonished not just at what she was telling me, but also how she would go about it, her body language, expressions, and emotional energy. As we got closer, she abruptly stopped walking. When I noticed I did as well and turned back to her. Before I could say anything, she placed her palm at the base of my sternum above my belly button / just below where my rib cage started. I immediately noticed a physical sensation. I became paralyzed and almost felt like she was stealing the breath from my body. I started becoming hyper-aware of my surroundings, the lights and dings from the electronic games, the mass amounts of people walking by, but everything seemed to be in slow motion or almost as if I was leaving my body. It could have been only a few seconds, it could have been 20 minutes, I don't know. But I felt as if I couldn't breathe and weakness in my knees. I started to feel like I was on the verge of passing out. Casino security saw this encounter and approached us. When security interrupted us to ask what was going on, it must have startled her because I felt this shockwave through my entire body. She jerked her hand back and started apologizing profusely to me. As soon as she pulled her hand back, I was able to breathe again and gained control back of my body. I was completely freaked out. It must have been visible because security kept asking me if I was okay. I assured them everything was fine, and they walked off. I turned back to the woman still apologizing, and she said, "If you don't do something about that ulcer, it's going to kill you." I was so freaked out I told her thanks, but I have to go back to work now, and quickly headed back to my office. Not only was I in a bizarre headspace, but I noticeably was completely void of physical energy. The entire experience was the most profound encounter of my life, and I will never forget those words and physical sensation. I was having a lot of stomach issues at the time, but I was far too scared to get medical verification of an ulcer. I had already previously suspected it, and it was a potential side effect of the medication I was on at that time. But if that wasn't bizarre enough on its own, it gets even weirder. The encounter happened nearly 10 years ago. And it has sat with me ever since, but recently was reflecting back on it. I realized that the second part about the coworker that initially made no sense all of a sudden did. That entire situation played out in my life a few years ago. The description of the person and the very specific details were 100% spot on from what was described to me 10 years ago. I even realized that the entire situation was initiated nearly 7 years, to the day, from the moment this woman described it to me. Not only were the two incidents separated by 7 years, but the person she described, I hadn't even met yet and was in an entirely different state and company. I don't know what to make of this. I've come here to see what others' take is. I'm open to this type of stuff, but I have always approached these situations skeptically. I'd love to hear what anyone has to say about it.